Hello. Hello, Vietnam. All right, so let me start by telling a bit about myself. So I started making games in 1994. Um, yeah, I'm that old. And maybe many of you weren't born yet. I was one of the first employee at Epic Games, and I started working on Epic Pinball. So I don't know if any of you remember this, but that's a pretty old game. Thanks. All right, so after that, I worked on Unreal and all the games in the Unreal franchise, all the versions of the Unreal Engine, and I was part of the team that created Gears of War. So after Epic, I worked at many companies, Webzen, Arkane Studio, Ubisoft, LucasArts, Bandai Namco, Virtuos, and NetEase. And there are some of the few games I worked on, so Ghost Recon, Star Wars, Ace Combat, Tomb Raider, Starlink, Alienware, Super Mega Champions. So, few games. I'm currently working as creative director on a Web2, Web3 startup called Affin. We're based in Singapore. And we're going to release our first game soon. It's called Buddy Arena, so feel free to check it out. All right, so today I want to talk about world design. World design is a critical element of game design. Right? It offers opportunities for exploration, influences the gameplay for players, and it's a tool for storytelling. So when designing something, you can take an iterative approach. So you start from the closest thing that you know that's doing what you're trying to do, like reference an existing game or start from something similar in the same genre that you want to do. You can change some aspect to solve the problems that you're facing. Take something and iterate on it. Or you can take a first principle approach, which is really like starting from the ground up and really thinking about the problem you're trying to solve and assemble the different elements required. So that's going to take longer. You're going to start from scratch. But if you manage to figure things out this way, you'll often end up with a better solution. Now, so let me use an example of a game world design where I use the first principles. So Unreal Tournament is an arena FPS shooter with focus on multiplayer deathmatch and capture the flag. I'll explain what that is. We call that CDF. To give you a bit of context, so here's a reminder of what the games looked like in the 90s. So we have Quake here, 1996. It was mostly indoor, like monochromatic, small rooms, small environments. And Unreal was first introduced with multiplayer deathmatch. Then we decided to add CTF afterwards. That was always only something that existed as a small mode for Quake. It wasn't in any commercial game at the time. So for those not familiar with the original CTF, way back, so there are two bases. And to score a point, you need to go to the enemy base, grab that flag, and bring it back to your own base while your flag is still there. So it's pretty complex. There's a lot of things you need to do at the same time. So I thought game would be pretty chaotic because player need to either grab the enemy flag in their base, come back and score a point, or if your teammate took that flag, then you have to support him and keep him alive. So as an attacker, you can play support. If you defend, on the other hand, so you need to prevent the enemies from coming to your base, and if they manage to come to your base and steal your flag, then you need to go and chase them. So there's basically four main roles that shift dynamically depending on what's happening during the battle. You can grab a flag, support a teammate, defend, or chase someone who stole your flag. So several of my teammates are starting to do CTF PlayStation on Quake mode, and they try to understand, like, okay, how did they do the maps? What are the flow? What are the path? How do we connect everything together? What are the bottlenecks? So they did a whole pass of analysis on the gameplay and try to find what was happening, how to improve it, or to build on it. So at the time, I was busy with other things, but I decided not to join those play sessions because I wanted to start fresh, right? I wanted to work a first principle approach. I was trying to imagine just knowing the rules, trying to imagine how the game would play. Right? So I just didn't play it. So here's how I created Facing World. So that ended up being the most successful map in Unreal Tournament. And what we had to work with at the time, I was using 160 polygons. So I remember that clearly, like we had this hard limit on what we could display on the screen. Okay, so at the time I was experimenting with using all the polygon budget, like the whole 160, on a single building, right? And at the time that was quite new, because if you're trying to do environment outside, well, you'd use 80 for your buildings, 80 for your landscape, and the buildings end up being cubes. Right? You couldn't really create any architecture. So I was trying to see what kind of architectural detail could be used for the next generation of games. That's 160 for one thing that was not going to work for the next game. Was doing experiments for the future. Because if I put everything in the building, I mean, there's nothing else for the landscape. All right. So I came up with the iconic look. It's vaguely Mayan, so you see this tower. Maybe some people still remember it today. I think what contributed to the success of the map was because one of the first-time players could see a detailed building that didn't look like a box, and you could see it from far, you could walk into it, and you could use part of the structure for combat. Right? So initially, I made this for just visual research, and I really didn't think about the gameplay at all, just experimenting. So when I started working on the CTF map, I decided to repurpose this big tower, and so I placed two of them facing each other, and restricted the movement around the bases so player could never see the two buildings at the same time. Right? Like if you see two, then you're over the limit. Right? So that's why the bases are pretty small around the building. But doing that trick, you never had more than 160 polygon in view from anywhere in the map. So I did a simple asteroid mesh with a few polygons, and I limited the walkable surface, just make sure players didn't see too much, spend a lot of time on that. And so, having gone through all those steps, what do I do with the environment, right? Like, I have no more polygons, right? Where do I put this? So I decided to put it in space, because I could use a detailed texture, well, at the time that was very detailed, and that's not using any polygons, so just using the texture, I could have my setting in space and make it look kind of interesting. And for those who remember, well, I did a trick where the whole sky would rotate, so when you're playing, the Earth is turning around, and you get that feel that you're in space, with the music and everything. All right, so at this point, I had my two towers facing each other in space. I had an open field, so that was good for gameplay because you could track what the enemy and what your teammates are doing. So you had good spatial awareness in the level. Like I said, that was really important for CTF, right? Like, try to understand and be aware of what your team and what the enemy are doing at all times. Okay, so that's when I started thinking about scoring. Like, how would you score in this? And at this point, I still hadn't played CTF, and I had two models in mind. Like, we had the basketball model and the soccer model. Right? So what do I mean by that? In basketball, scoring is pretty easy, right? And defending is hard. So that's why the game always ends up with large scores, where you get 100 points to 88, something like that. There's a lot of micro-excitement, right? A lot of scoring, but ultimately the game is more like a game of attrition where you need to have a lot of stamina to sustain your pace and get an edge over time. The soccer model, on the other hand, so scoring is much harder, and defending is easier. That's why when you see a soccer match, the score can be 0-0, 1-1. Well, it's really rare to see a game with more than 3 or 4 goals. Right? So there's a lot of tension. You could think, this is very boring. Actually, it's not. Right? The tension is building, and then when you get one score, it's like a huge, event, right? A huge release of pressure and joy, and you see people running around in soccer, but you don't see that in basketball so much, right? It's not as much. All right, so I thought the soccer model would work well for CTF because it's going to foster more cooperation between the players. I tried to make the towers easier to defend. So I opened up some windows and sniping points that weren't present before, and added some elevators. Right? So I have more windows, more places to stand. You have elevators to go all the way to the top. And I thought that's going to make the tower easier to defend. Then the added benefit was that those defensive windows could also be used by attackers on the opposite tower. So they could take down the defender to support a teammate, running back to the base, for example, without being sniped. So just that change added a lot of depth because you have to worry about attacking, you have to worry about the opposite defenders on the opposite tower. There's a lot going on, but it's still all in view and easy to understand. So that created a lot of depth for the gameplay and many opportunities for well-coordinated team to really compete really hard in this level. But it was never frustrating for the new players because they could always understand what's happening. And then the open-ended line of sight, the visibility in the map really contributed to the fact that player could follow, even if they hadn't a lot of experience with the game, they could always follow what was happening. Okay, so easy to get and hard to master is always something game designers try to achieve. And I think I managed to do that here with a layout that's very simple, and it offers a broad range of tactics, a lot more than you could think just looking at it. Right? You could think it's very simple, but people have played hundreds of hours in this map and still discover new things you can do. For example, you can teleport all the way to the back, climb the steps, and attack the tower from the top. Right? So I discovered that after the map was released. Was intended. Okay, so I brought the map all the way to this point without actually playing a single CTF map before. So I made all those changes to the existing towers before playtesting. So from there, we started doing playtests, of course. So we verifying the assumption, right? Is all this effort for creating the defensive point going to work? So we just tested it, played a lot. We made some few changes to the distances and the layout, but it didn't change that much, right? Very little change. So ultimately, this map became a great success. It was played more than all the other maps in Unreal Tournament combined. And yeah, 25 years later, sometimes it's still mentioned in gaming magazine, and people still remember. It inspired some remakes, and those are from a couple of years ago, so that was something that was memorable. Okay, so the main point I wanted to get across today, if you remember anything about this talk, then please remember this. I think if I had played CTF maps before, I think it would have influenced my perception of the mode, and I think it would have been unlikely I would have created something novel. I would have looked at what the other game was doing, I would have done something similar, tweak it, but I wouldn't have come up with that facing worlds, for sure. So it's very easy today to reference other games or other levels because there's so much content out there. Right? It's very tempting to see what other people are doing, do the same, tweak it, take several games, mix and match, try to come up with something new. But often the design process starts with a competitive analysis, or just trying to make a new game by mixing different aspects of the project. But when you design from first principles, and if you're asking what are the fundamental problems we're trying to solve, thinking from the ground up can really be a chance to create something new. All right. Thank you.